A Cornish Maid. Side 11. I wish I could spend every minute with you in these 3 days, darling. But my mother wants us to visit her cousins who were bombed out in Plymouth. So that'll take care of tomorrow. I thought you meant we were having 3 days together. So did I, until I heard about these cousins. But I could hardly say no, could I? I'd much rather be here with you, Amber, believe me. Somehow the war had intruded on them again. The mention of Luke's mother's cousins, who had been bombed out in Plymouth, was enough to remind them that their brief idyll was over. Inevitably, and almost against their will, they found themselves talking about people they knew who had been killed. Most recently, the girls at the Lanigan Hotel, and poor Eddie Fielding. Whoever would have put Eddie Fielding down as a hero, Luke said. But they're all heroes these days, especially the poor devils fighting in France. What about you? It can't be any picnic going to sea and never knowing if your ship's going to be sunk, or for the airmen being blown out of the sky. No, I wouldn't say it's a picnic for any of us. But we do it because we have to, and one day soon, please God, it'll all be over and we'll all be coming home again. Most of us, anyway, he added. Amber shivered, not with pleasure now, but with a sense of foreboding. She didn't like this kind of talk. She didn't like it when the newspapers bragged about sinking the German battleships. She knew everyone cheered when they heard such news, but common sense told her that at the same time the German newspapers could be bragging about sinking one of their own. One day, it could be Luke's ship. She hugged his arm. They had been sitting in the car for too long now, and their mood had grown sombre along with the coolness of the night. The earlier euphoria of their lovemaking had vanished for the moment, and Amber didn't know how to bring it back. "You're cold," he said. "Do you want to come and have some supper with us? I was supposed to ask you earlier, but it sort of got forgotten," he said with a grin. She didn't particularly want to sit and make conversation with his mum and dad, but the alternative was going home, and she'd prefer to go back to the cottage much later when she was sure her gran would have gone to bed, rather than risk her suspicious looks about what had been happening that evening. So she accepted the invitation to have supper with the Gillams, and had to be content with sitting across the table from Luke and interpreting the occasional smile he gave her, which told her there was no doubt that he was remembering too. 3 days' leave was impossibly short, especially when one day was taken out of it by visiting relatives in Plymouth. Amber was shamefully jealous of these cousins who had taken Luke's precious time away from her, and impatient for him to return for the one last day of his leave. When he did, it was a wet and blustery day, with an even worse evening, and no possibility of repeating the time they had already had, and nowhere they could go to be alone. In Granny Penn's cottage, the three of them played a game of Monopoly until Granny Penn decided she was going to have an early night, as the weather was playing havoc with her rheumatics. "Don't be too late now," she said to Amber. "And just remember, I've got good hearing, so don't be thinking I don't know how young uns carry on with your canoodling. You take good care of yourself, Luke, and come back safely." "Thank you, Granny Penn," he said solemnly, and only once they were sure that the last creak on the stairs meant she was closing her bedroom door did they burst into laughter. "Oh, shush!" Amber gasped. "You heard what she said. She knows how we young uns carry on, and she's probably putting a tumbler to the ground to catch us with our canoodling." "I think that only applies when you put the tumbler to a wall. But it would be a shame to disappoint the old girl, wouldn't it?" Luke whispered. "If she's expecting canoodling, then we should give her canoodling." It was all they could do, and if she was honest, for Amber it was enough to sit close to him on the old sofa, his arms around her, and snuggle up to him. To snatch an extra hour of love-making in this cottage would take away the importance of that first lovely time, when there had been such a sense of freedom in the wild place they both loved, with the sounds of the sea all around them and only the seabirds to hear. But they could kiss and hold one another and know that their lives were inextricably bound together, as they had always been destined to be. It wasn't until he had finally left Falmouth and gone back to his mates and back to the sea that Amber realised anew the enormity of her loss. They had made love, and she had had something of him that no one else had ever had. They had shared one another's bodies, and now she had no idea when she would see him again. It had happened to thousands of others, but until it happened to her, she hadn't fully realised what a wrench it would be. And this was one experience she had no intention of sharing with anyone else, least of all Dolly, who would want to know every detail and was going to hear none. She knew the dangers of making love before marriage, but she admitted that it was something that had not occurred to her at all while she and Luke were in the cave. If the unthinkable happened and she found she was expecting a baby, she knew the shame and scandal would be too great for Granny Penn to bear. But it didn't happen, and when her monthlies began a week later, her relief was mixed with a weird kind of guilty resentment, because this would have been something of Luke's that no one could take from her. They would have had to kill her first, she thought fiercely. As it was, there was nothing to show that they had been together, only the feelings in her heart and the large X in her diary on the day it happened. She wasn't going to enjoy Christmas either, knowing that he wouldn't be coming home on leave. In fact, she set out deliberately not to enjoy any of it, until Granny Penn at home and the girls at work began to get fed up with her. As Jenny and the others hung up decorations in the Forces Club, they turned on her angrily. "If you can't help, at least don't stand there with that sulky look on your face," Jenny snapped at her. "Do you think you're the only girl in the world who won't have her boy coming home for Christmas? Think yourself lucky he's coming home at all. There's plenty that won't. Here," she went on, tossing a bundle of tinsel at Amber. "Hang this around the tree, and then I'll tell you some news to make you smile." "What sort of news?" Amber said sullenly, not relishing the way she was being made to feel so petulant, yet knowing she deserved it. "We had a visit from some of the chaps at the GI base last night while you were off. They want to put on a Christmas party here for the local infants, and they're providing the food and everything." "Crikey, are they?" Amber said. "Yes, and since you're doing so little work around here, you can have the job of going round the infant schools to spread the word. Perhaps it'll cheer you up." It cheered her already. Amber thought it was such a sweet and generous gesture from the Yanks, but having seen the way they always stopped to chat to the kids and passed on sweets and chocolate, it was no wonder the friendship was mutual. If so-called Anglo-American relations started with the children, Amber thought, then it wasn't doing such a bad job. It was good to get out of the club, too. It wasn't fair to take it out on everybody else just because she was feeling miserable. That was just what people did, though. It wasn't peculiar to her. She vowed to make it up to Granny Penn when she went home that evening, and since she had souvenirs very much on her mind now, she stopped at Veal's craft shop to buy her something. "Still working at that Forces Club, are you?" Myra said, as if it was something immoral. "Yep. Still stuck behind the counter here, are you?" "It was good enough for you, as I remember, miss, so don't look down your nose at me. Were you wanting something? If not, I've got work to do." "How's Mrs. Veal?" Amber remembered to ask. "Is she well?" "Well enough. Now then, tell me what you want, and if you're looking for a job, there's no vacancy." Amber bit back a tart reply. There was no point, and the sooner she was away from this unpleasant woman, the better. On impulse, she chose one of the lighthouse models that Gary had bought for his girl. If Granny Penn didn't like it, Amber could always put it in her bedroom and start her own collection. She was glad to get out of the shop. Once she had loved the aromatic scents of candles and herbs, but it didn't benefit from having Myra's cheap perfume added to it. Perhaps she was hoping to attract a GI for herself, Amber thought, stifling a laugh. He'd have to be wearing a blindfold first. She was in a far happier mood by the time she had visited the infant schools and passed on the information about the Christmas party. She was greeted as some kind of divine messenger, she told Granny Penn later. The kids went wild and cheered at the prospect of having a party laid on for them by the Americans. "It's a very generous thing for them to do," Granny Penn agreed. "The poor little dabs all have to grow up early in these uncertain times. And so do you older ones, too." "What does that mean?" "It means it's a shame to let go of childhood before you have to, Amber. There's time enough for falling in love and settling down. There are plenty of years ahead for that." "Tell that to my friends at school, who won't have the chance for any of it." "I think you know what I mean, my dear. I've heard tales about what some of the local girls and the Americans get up to. Nice and friendly they may be, but once this war is over, they'll be going home to their own friends and families, and it doesn't pay to get too close." "Well, I wasn't getting too close to Gary, and I never intended to either. He's got a girl of his own, and he showed me her photo. He's just a friend, that's all." "And what of Luke? Is he still just a friend?" Amber felt as if her blood was curdling inside her. She didn't want to remember that everyone said that Granny Penn could see things, with or without the tea leaves and the palm reading. She didn't want to think that Granny Penn had the slightest notion, real or imaginary, of that one magical evening with Luke in the cave below Pendennis Hill. It was private, and it was theirs alone. "He's my best friend," she said defensively. "He always has been, and I hope he always will be." "Then, if he's the one you want, you have my blessing." She had never spoken so frankly before, and Amber stared at her in astonishment for a moment, until Granny Penn sighed and patted her hand. "I wasn't born yesterday, Amber, love. A girl has a certain glow about her when she finds the right young man for her, and you have it every time you speak about Luke, whether you realize it or not. Just be aware that although the Americans are charming young men too, reputation can very soon be sullied." Amber breathed more easily. Granny Penn wasn't referring to the certain glow she must have had when she came home that night. It was just a friendly general warning. Impulsively, she kissed her Gran's leathery cheek. "I know. And you don't need to worry about me, Gran. I think I've always known that Luke was the one for me. And before you say that 16, nearly 17, is too young to know my own mind, well, it isn't. It just isn't." She finished so fiercely that Granny Penn smiled. "I wouldn't dare to dispute it." The preparations for the infants' Christmas party, arranged and paid for by the Americans, caused plenty of excitement in the town. Not all of the Yanks had something to celebrate, though, as word filtered through about casualties and fatalities, and at one time Amber feared that Gary had been among them. But he turned up again, like a bad penny, he said, though with a certain tightening around his jaw that hadn't been there before. Like most of them, he rarely spoke about where he had been or how bad it had been. There had been another letter from Luke at the beginning of December, and because they knew all Force's letters were censored before being sent home, he was guarded in the things he said. She had to read between the lines to know what his real feelings were and how much he was missing her. He missed her even more now, he said, because of that last brief leave together, and she knew exactly what he meant by that. It also meant he was thinking of her and remembering how close they had been, the way she remembered it, and it warmed her heart. Dolly's letter, just before Christmas, was full of complaints. "I'm really fed up with my mum and Uncle Joe kissing and slurping all over the place. That's when they ain't squabbling, of course. I may come down and see you in the summer, Amber. as long as Jerry leaves us alone. A neighbour along the road from us had an unexploded bomb on her doorstep, and it really put the wind up us all until the army chaps came and disarmed it. Real dishy lot of chaps they were, too. Me and Mum made them cups of tea while the poor old biddy was having the vapours or something. And I nearly got a date with one of them. She didn't explain why it was only nearly, Amber thought with a grin. She thought about what Dolly said about coming down for a visit and couldn't decide if she would welcome it or not. She couldn't say no, but time and distance had changed them both. And if they had been rivals of a sort when they were children, how much more would they be now that they were virtually grown up? She knew her gran would say it was unworthy of her, so she simply didn't reply to that part of Dolly's letter at all. If it happened, it happened. And if it didn't, well, it didn't. The Christmas party took precedence over everything at the Forces Club that month, and even though one or two people mentioned that it would be nice to make it an annual event, the main hope was that it wouldn't be necessary, because the war would soon be over and the Yanks would all have gone home by this time next year. But there was no denying the infants' joy in having the kind of food laid on for them that few of the youngest ones had even seen before. The Americans organised games for them as well, and every child went home with a balloon and what their hosts called a bag full of goodies. It was easy to forget there was a war on at such times, and if the Jerrys were also taking advantage of the special season to temporarily slow down their bombing raids, people could only offer up a heartfelt prayer of thankfulness. Do you think that somewhere in occupied France the German soldiers are doing this for the French kids? Amber asked, Jenny idly. The other woman snorted. If they are, I doubt that many French mothers would let their kids attend. The Jerrys might do it to try to curry favour, but it's a different situation in France. The Yanks here are our allies, not our enemy. If the Jerrys offered to put on a party for the French kids, they'd probably be spat on, even if they risked getting shot for it. Amber was shocked at her vehemence, and Jenny shrugged. Don't look like that, kid. My old granddad was in the first lot, and he told me a thing or two about Jerrys. Not that I think our lot would be any better if it came to the point. You don't bother about manners when a bloke's pointing a rifle at your head or sticking a bayonet in your gut. It's everyone for himself then. I rarely talk about it, and I'm not mentioning it again. But take it from me, Amber. Nobody behaves in a civilised way when they're fighting for their lives. These Hollywood pictures don't tell you the half of it. Believe me. Amber hadn't expected any of this, and she wasn't sure how it had all started. But since Jenny seemed genuinely disturbed, she changed the conversation quickly. It was only later that she learned from Granny Penn that Jenny's granddad had been terribly wounded and shell-shocked in the First World War and still suffered unbearable nightmares because of it all these years later. It made Amber wonder uneasily about the after-effects of being involved in the fighting, let alone being wounded, and if people ever really got over it. She was still thinking about it as the church bells rang out on that Christmas day when the war had already lasted for more than 4 years. Every Christmas and New Year that came and went, they hoped desperately that this would be the turning point, until another one came and went. In the first few months of 1944, Amber had to accept the fact that letters from Luke were going to be sparse, if they came at all. Whenever she saw his mother, she asked about him and got the same reply, that there was no use worrying until they had something to worry about. Mrs. Gillam seemed so calm about everything, fumed Amber. Not that she thought Luke's mother could be so calm underneath, but such complacency didn't do much to help somebody who was only 17 and aching to see her sweetheart again. She longed for him with a fever of impatience she had never known before. Then, 2 months after her 17th birthday, something happened that overshadowed everything else. Luke, the bombing raids, the floods of more and more Americans coming into the area in preparation for the Allied invasion of France. It was no secret any more that it was going to happen. The only question in everyone's mind was when. Amber was up early on that Sunday morning in April. It was going to be a fine spring day, and there were wild daffodils pushing up in their small garden among the cabbages and carrots that took the place of other flowers now. It was so unusual for Granny Penn not to be up and about that Amber decided to take her a cup of tea in bed. She knew her Gran probably wouldn't thank her for it, since she considered such a thing as being more for the upper classes who had nothing better to do with their time. She would also be horrified to think she had overslept. Amber tapped on her bedroom door and then pushed it open. Granny Penn still lay neatly in her bed, the way she always did, in a way that was a marvel to Amber, whose bedclothes resembled more of a jumble sale by morning. She put the tea down on the little side table beside her Gran's bed and spoke teasingly. "Come on, Granny Lazybones. If you don't get a move on, it'll be time for church before you're up and dressed." When there was no response, Amber felt the first flicker of fear run through her. Her legs were reluctant to move as she got nearer to the bed and put out a shaking hand to touch Granny Penn's cheek. It was cold, and there was no reaction from her at all. Amber flinched back, her heart thumping violently. "Wake up, Granny Penn," she croaked. "Please, wake up. Please, don't be dead." As the word was wrenched out of her, she let out a small scream, because it was blindingly obvious that the old woman in the bed was dead. And Amber was 17 and she didn't know what to do. Grief hadn't yet broken through her instant panic, but it would, and she knew that it would. She felt as though time had stopped and had no meaning any more. She felt as if she stood transfixed for hours, and yet it was only seconds before she was sobbing and backing away from the woman who had always given her such love and care and was no longer there. In those first horrific moments, that was all she could think about. There was no supernatural sense of souls hovering, or afterlives, or angels watching over her from some ethereal nowhere. There was only a great feeling of nothingness and loss. She turned and ran down the stairs of the cottage, still sobbing. She was breathing so hard and so fast that she felt as if she was suffocating, and she had to get outside in the fresh air because the house itself was stifling her. Over the fence, their neighbour, Mrs. Phillips, was cutting one of her cabbages for Sunday dinner and looked up in astonishment at Amber's obvious distress. The cabbage dropped from her hand as she came quickly towards the fence. "Whatever's wrong, Amber, love?" "Can you come?" Amber gasped. "It's Granny Penn. She's still in bed and she's not moving. She won't wake up." It would have taken a team of horses to drag the dreaded word from her lips again, but it was clear to Mrs. Phillips what she meant. "I'll just fetch father," she said quickly, "and then we'll come and see what's what, my dear." She always called her husband father, just as Mrs. Veal had done, Amber thought wildly, and found herself wondering what they had called their own fathers, and if they had ever got them confused. Thinking about anything, however inane, was better than knowing she had to go back upstairs to face the truth of what had happened during the night. She felt the choking sobs rising in her throat again as the questions began to storm through her mind. When had it happened? And how long had Granny Penn lain there like that? And had it hurt, this dying? Or had she simply drifted from one sleep to another? The neighbours came around to the cottage, and Mrs. Phillips took Amber firmly by the arm as father walked behind them, clearing his throat all the way. "Now, you go inside, Amber, love, and put the kettle on for a hot, strong cup of tea. 'Tis always the best remedy in cases of shock, and 'tis clear that you've had one this morning. Me and father will go upstairs and check on Granny Penn and see whether we need the doctor or the undertaker, or both." She said it brutally, knowing it would shake Amber,
But it was best for the little maid to accept it, rather than have false hopes, she thought silently. From the sound of it, she was quite sure Granny Pen would have died in the night, and it was exactly what she and Father found when they went to see the old lady, looking as peaceful as if she was sleeping the sleep of the just. Amber heard their heavy steps on the stairs a few minutes later, by which time she had just about managed to fill the kettle with water, spilling half of it over herself, and put it on the gas. Now she was carrying a tray of cups into the parlour and trying not to drop it with her shaking hands. "Sit yourself down a minute, Amber, and we'll have that tea when the kettle's boiled. Meanwhile, Father will run and get the doctor." "Is she all right then?" Amber gasped wildly as Father left them to do his errand. Mrs. Phillips shook her head sorrowfully. "Oh, my dear, if you're asking if she's all right in this world, then she's not. But I dare say she's more than all right in the next. She'll be up in heaven right now, reading the tea leaves of the angels. I wouldn't be surprised." This was too much for Amber. She banged the tray of cups down on the table, rattling them so hard it was a wonder they didn't all crack. "How stupid you are!" she raged. "My Gran's lying dead upstairs, and all you can say is that she's reading the bloody tea leaves for the angels in heaven." She swore without realizing it, and she had never been so rude to a neighbour before, but nothing was normal anymore. She registered that Mrs. Phillips had delicately avoided mentioning the undertaker again, but he would have to be informed, and he would come to the cottage, all hush-voiced and sombre-faced and black-suited, and they would bring the hated burial box into the cottage and take her Gran away. She found herself gasping for breath, and the room jazzed in front of her eyes, and before she knew what was happening, she felt Mrs. Phillips thrust her head between her knees and tell her to breathe slowly and deeply. When she had done so for a few minutes, the urge to vomit and faint had diminished, and she felt ashamed of her outburst when the woman was only doing her best for her. She sat up carefully, trying to be more calm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Lord love you, my dear. If a body can't let rip in times of trouble, when can they? No offence taken, my love. You cuss all you want, if it makes you feel better." It didn't, and she knew it wouldn't. But she gave Mrs. Phillips a wan smile after she had fussed about making the tea, and insisted that Amber drink the hot sweet mixture. There were tea leaves floating about on top, and without warning the tears flowed again as she imagined her Gran taking the empty cup, turning it upside down, swirling the leaves about in the bottom, and giving one of her mysterious prophecies. Well, Amber didn't need that now. She knew what the future held. She was totally alone in the world from now on. "I wish Luke was here," she whimpered against her will, and was immediately thankful that Mrs. Phillips hadn't heard her since she was tidying up for the doctor's visit. Why did people always do that? Amber wondered in a fit of pique. Didn't doctors have untidy houses as well as ordinary folk? She knew she was still thinking of anything but the reality of what lay ahead of her. The doctor came quite soon and went straight upstairs with Mrs. Phillips. Amber knew guiltily that she was letting everyone else take over and simply allowed them to do it. There would be time enough when she had to do the necessary things after they had taken Granny Pen away, all the sorting out to be done, the clothes, the personal possessions that were so private when a person was alive and became public property for any prying eyes after their death. She took a shuddering breath. At least there would be no other prying eyes but hers for her Gran, she thought fiercely. It was her first positive thought since early morning. She hadn't realized she had shut her eyes tightly, as if to will all other thoughts away, until she heard the doctor's voice. "Amber, my dear, I have to tell you, but your grandmother died in her sleep sometime during the night. It must have been a peaceful passing, because there are no signs of any distress, so you should take that as a small consolation." Amber bit her lips hard. If she hadn't, she would have fallen into what Granny Penn always called one of her contrary moods, picking on every annoying little word that wasn't absolutely accurate. People didn't pass anywhere. They died, and how she hated that word, should. Nobody could tell another person how they should feel, or react, or grieve. Until it happened to you, you had no idea how you would feel, and there was no should about it. And, oh God, she was being so petty now, when everyone only wanted to help. She knew that, but nobody could help. This was something you had to face alone, whether you were the dying or the bereaved. "What happens next?" she muttered, since the doctor was obviously waiting for a reply. "I'm going to issue a death certificate," he said briskly, "and then I will alert the undertaker to come and attend to the body. There are certain things to be done, Amber, and then he will make arrangements to take her to the chapel of rest. You don't have to think about that right now," he added, seeing her flinch. "It's a lot to take in for a young girl. It's unfortunate that it's a Sunday and people will be at church, but I'm sure Mr. Horsley will be here as soon as possible in the circumstances." "Well, I'm sorry to inconvenience him in having Grand Eye on a Sunday," Amber heard herself snap before she could stop herself. Mrs. Phillips drew in her breath at such impertinence, which almost amounted to blasphemy, but the doctor merely patted Amber's hand. "We can't determine the moment of our birth or our death, my dear. We leave that to the Almighty to decide." "Or Hitler," Amber muttered, hardly knowing where the words were coming from, but seemingly unable to stop them. "Or Hitler, indeed," the doctor said, glancing at Mrs. Phillips. "Do you know if there's any brandy in the house, Mrs. Phillips? I think a medicinal drop might be advisable just now." "In the sideboard," Amber said mechanically. She knew where everything was kept. It was still their house, hers and her grant's, but she supposed it was her house now, just hers. She drank the bitter-tasting stuff that was thrust into her hand and let it wash down her throat, burning and rasping. Or was that just the result of so many tears? She could hear the mumble of voices between the doctor and her neighbour, and then he left, and Mrs. Phillips took her cold hands in hers. "You're not to be alone, Amber, love. You're to come and have some dinner with us, and come and sleep in our cottage tonight." Amber looked at her. "Why would I want to do that? I've got a bed here, and I can't leave Gran here alone." Even as she said it, she felt an odd sense of calm wash over her, and she knew she wasn't sending Granny Penn away to some anonymous chapel of rest. Not yet, anyway. This was her home, and once the undertaker had done whatever he had to do, Granny Penn was going to stay here in her own bed for at least one more night. After that, well, she would decide what to do then. "Then I'll sleep here too," Mrs. Phillips said. "I'll manage perfectly well on the sofa. It's not right for a young maid like you to be alone in the house with a corpse." "Don't call her that. She's still my Gran, and she wouldn't want to be called by such a horrible name." "Well, I'm sorry," the neighbour said uncomfortably, "but I'll still sleep here for tonight, Amber, and you'll be glad of the company, whatever you might think. As for your dear Gran, she's had a long life and deserves her rest." Amber bit her lips hard again, thinking they would be black and blue if she didn't stop it, but knowing she would probably explode after such a daft statement. She was perfectly sure her Gran hadn't wanted a permanent rest, and she wasn't ready for it any more than Amber was. Later, Mrs. Phillips told Father that she hoped the young maid wasn't going to go all weird. It happened sometimes, and it was well known that Granny Penn had had the second sight, so her granddaughter probably wasn't far behind. The morning passed in a kind of nightmare for Amber. Her neighbour insisted that she should go next door with them to have some dinner, although it was all she could do to pick at the food when it eventually arrived. Crazy things kept floating in and out of her mind. Granny Penn would never sit down to dinner again. Granny Penn never liked to miss church the way she had done today, and now she would never be going to church on a Sunday morning again. When Father muttered that the undertaker was coming along the road, they all went back to Amber's cottage, and suddenly it seemed as if it was full of people. The undertaker's assistant was with him, and she watched them go upstairs to her Gran's bedroom, not wanting to imagine what was going on up there, nor how indignant Granny Penn would be at having certain things done to her, of which Mrs. Phillips had found gruesomely necessary to inform Amber. By the time the undertaker and his assistant came back downstairs, Amber was near to hysteria. They had a strange smell about them that she couldn't identify, that made her long for fresh air again. But she knew they wanted to speak to her, and she made herself listen to what they had to say. No, she didn't want Granny Penn removed just yet. This was her home, and she had a right to remain in it a while longer. But yes, they could bring the coffin and take her away in time to prepare for the burial. Until then, Amber wanted her Gran to remain in her own bed.
"It's not usual, Miss Penry," the undertaker said. "Most folk want to be settled decently in their coffins, for friends and family to come and pay their last respects."
"Well, I don't want people to come gawping at my Gran, and most folk don't want to be settled in their coffins at all," she said shrilly. "What's wrong with her staying in her own bed for a few days longer anyway? Is there any objection to it?"
"Not really," the man said uneasily. "But let's say just for 2 more days at the most. By then, well, it will be time, my dear."
Amber could still hardly take in that she was obliged to be making plans for Granny Penn's burial, but finally it was all arranged, and after the undertaker and his assistant left to make the arrangements with the vicar on Amber's behalf, she looked at Mrs. Phillips. "What did he mean? That it would be time? What wasn't he telling me?" Mrs. Phillips cleared her throat delicately, trying to find the right words. It was her more practical husband who provided them.
"The weather's getting very warm already, Amber. And even though it's nothing like a hot country, I was in India during the last war, and they always buried their dead the next day because of the heat. It turns them, you see," he added gruffly.
"Turns them?" she echoed. He cleared his throat noisily.
"You know, what happens to dead meat when it goes off? Well, we're no different from meat when we go off, see?"
For a second, Amber didn't understand, and then she felt the bile rise in her throat at the picture he was painting. She scrambled to her feet, her heart beating painfully fast.
"That's horrible! Well, I wish you'd never told me." "Well, you would ask," the man said. "I didn't mean to upset you, but it's best if you realise that the undertaker knows what's best for your old Gran. Now then, if you want me to do any errands, you just tell me, my dear, and my missus will stay here with you for the rest of the day."
She tried to will the image of her Gran turning out of her mind and concentrate on what he was saying now. Of course, there were people to be told. She couldn't go back to work until after the burial, so her employers had to know. She wished desperately that Luke was here, but he wasn't. But she knew his mother would want to know what had happened. And there was Dolly. She caught her breath on a sob, wishing so hard that Dolly was here with her no-nonsense approach to life and death and everything in between. "I'll give you a list," she gasped, knowing that if she didn't do something with her hands, she would burst into tears again. "There's only Jenny at the Forces Club and Mrs. Gillam at the boatyard, and tomorrow it's very important that I send a telegram to Dolly in London."
"You just write it out for me, and I'll see that it's sent off in the morning," Mr. Phillips said. "Do you think the little maid will come for the burying, then?"
"I know she will," said Amber, knowing no such thing, but mentally crossing her fingers and toes and everything else. With Mr. Phillips spreading the word, the news that Granny Penn had died got around the town very quickly. All afternoon and into the evening, people came to the cottage, offering sympathy and gifts of flowers. Some people merely left them at the gate rather than intruding on a family's grief. As well as flowers, there was garden produce and a few bags of homemade biscuits, until Amber wondered if everyone thought she was about to starve just because her gran was dead. She had to keep repeating the word to herself now, making it real, making it less bizarre than it had been that early morning when she had taken her gran a cup of tea. It was impossible to think that had only been this morning. It seemed a lifetime ago, and yet it seemed like only a second ago. Side 12. How long had it taken her to die, she wondered. Did she know, or had she simply stopped breathing in her sleep? She still couldn't get the ghoulish questions out of her mind, nor had she yet gone back up those stairs to see her gran, laid out so nicely now, according to Mrs. Phillips, and looking a real picture with all the lines in her face smoothed away. One or two people, old friends of Granny Penn, had asked to see her, and Amber had felt obliged to allow it, even if she couldn't understand their need. Why did they do it? She raged. Why would anyone want to do it? It's to say your last goodbye, Mrs. Phillips told her, over so many endless cups of tea that Amber felt she was going to burst with it all. And you must do it too, Amber. Your gran would expect it, and she would want you to. I can't, Amber whispered. I just can't. Not now the undertaker has done those things to her. She looks beautiful, like a young girl, Mrs. Phillips went on, which was a comment that could have made Amber laugh out loud had she not felt more like weeping. It's important for you to touch her, Amber, and to kiss her too. It will bring to a close the lifetime you've spent with her. Amber listened to this in horror. Perhaps when you were old, you could talk about such things without feeling the hairs on the back of your neck curl up and freeze. Perhaps you became more accepting of death when you were old, and it wasn't so far away. And then, in an instant, she remembered all the young people who were dying in the war, even her own old school friends, and she knew how their mothers and fathers would want to hug them and kiss them for one last heartbreaking time before they were committed to the ground forever, and she felt ashamed of her weakness. Have I done wrong in wanting to keep Gran here? She said, choked. No, love, but I think you might ask Father to see the undertaker again tomorrow and have her removed to the Chapel of Rest quite soon. It's more dignified, and it would be what she wanted, I'm sure. Before that happens, then, I must say goodbye to her properly. Good girl. She'll like that. Amber didn't bother to comment on the fact that she spoke in the present tense, as if her gran was still here, and would be aware of the moment when Amber went to see her and touch her and kiss her, if she could. At least she intended to try, and she had to admit that she was disbelieving that Mrs. Phillips thought Granny Penn looked like a young girl again. It was something Amber couldn't imagine, never having seen her as anything but her old gran. In the early evening, Luke's mother arrived. She took Amber into her arms without a word, until the girl had managed to stop sobbing against her shoulder. "My poor little love, this must have been a terrible shock to you," she said at last. "As soon as I heard, I wrote a letter to Luke, and then I came right here." "Thank you," Amber whispered, thinking she would have done that herself, if only she had been left alone long enough. But it seemed that people never wanted to leave you alone when you had been bereaved. "I'd like to say goodbye to your Gran," Mrs. Gillam said, when she had accepted her cup of tea from Mrs. Phillips, who told her cheerfully that until Amber felt better, she was taking over as general housekeeper cum dog's body. "Will you take me to her, Amber?" Amber took a deep breath. This was the moment, then, and if she couldn't yet do it on her own, who better to share it with than the mother of her sweetheart? She nodded, and they went upstairs together, to where the sweet, sickly smell drifted out from her Gran's bedroom. Mrs. Gillam walked straight to the bed where Granny Pen lay, the sheets neatly covering her body now in total repose. Luke's mother said a few soft words that Amber couldn't hear, then put her fingers to her lips and pressed them gently onto Granny Pen's cheek. She glanced back to where Amber still stood uncertainly near the door and gave her a gentle smile. "She never hurt you in her lifetime, Amber, and she won't hurt you now." As she held out her hand, Amber walked slowly towards her until she was looking down at her Gran's face. She didn't look like a young girl, she thought, but she didn't look creepy either. She just looked like her Gran. Luke's mother moved quietly away from the bed until there were just the two of them together, the grandmother and the young Cornish maid she had always loved as devotedly as if she was her own child. Amber knelt by her side and tentatively stroked the grey hair away from her forehead, knowing those caring eyes would never open again, and that sweet mouth would never give her words of wisdom again. But she would always remember them, she thought fiercely. She would never forget the woman who had always meant more to her than anyone else in the world. But Mrs. Phillips had been right. Granny Pen had lived a long life and deserved her rest. She leaned forward and kissed the papery cheek and said her last goodbye, knowing she would never set foot in this room again while her Gran remained here. "I love you, Gran," she whispered. "I'll always love you." The funeral had been arranged for the following Friday. Before then, with Granny Pen now at the Chapel of Rest, Mrs. Phillips had insisted that Amber should go next door and play a game of cards with Father while she sorted out her Gran's bedroom and got it thoroughly aired and took the bedding away to be washed. Amber couldn't imagine anything stranger than wanting to play a game of cards with Father, but she did as she was told, still moving like an automaton, as everything led up to the day when the final goodbyes were to be said. Her nerves were constantly on edge, and even though Mrs. Phillips still insisted on sleeping with her each night, the sound of her snuffling breathing from the bed that had been Dolly's was enough to keep Amber awake for hours. The night before the funeral, Amber was especially jittery. It was a necessary ritual to get through, and there had been plenty of those in the town lately, both for young and old, but it didn't make the thought of it any easier when it was someone close to you. She was trying hard to enjoy the vegetable stew that Mrs. Phillips had prepared when there was a knock at the cottage door, and she left the meal thankfully as she went to answer it. "Thank God," said Dolly. "It's starting to rain, and I didn't fancy getting soaked as well as bleeding well exhausted from the train journey. Are you going to let me in, gal? I need to drop this suitcase before my bleeding arms drop off." Amber simply stared at her for a moment, and then they were hugging one another and weeping on one another's shoulders until Dolly shrugged her off and pushed her way into the cottage. "I dare say you've done enough crying in the past few days," she said. "So, I've come to cheer you up. I can always keep down in Granny Pen's old room if you've got next door in to keep you company," she added, not missing the way Mrs. Phillips was looking her up and down. Unless you've moved in there yourself.
No, I haven't, Amber said quickly, never having thought of such a thing. But your old bed's still in my room, and I expect Mrs. Phillips will be glad to get back home now you're here for the funeral.
Oh, don't worry. I'm here for more than that, Dolly declared. I've come to stay.
Before Dolly came back, Amber had written a long, impassioned letter to Luke, pouring out her heart to him and being far more emotional in a letter than she had ever been before. She had no idea when he would receive it or when he would be able to reply. She knew his mother had written to tell him of Granny Penn's death, but she also needed to do it herself, to feel that bit closer to him while she wrote the words that filled her heart. On the day of the funeral, a huge number of people had turned up to pay their own respects to a well-known figure who had been in the town for so many years. She was known to all, and even feared by some who were nervous of her powers and her second sight, whether it was real or imaginary. But whatever people thought of her, they could never ignore her, and according to Dolly, that was better than being famous.
How do you make that out?
Amber said, trying to sound interested. Glad as she had been to see Dolly, she was quickly realizing she could find nothing in common with this newly smart girl, whose hair was an even brighter shade of blonde than before, which Mrs. Phillips had said darkly owed a lot to the peroxide bottle.
Stands to reason, Dolly sniffed. When you're famous, you got something to live up to, and you can soon be forgotten when somebody better comes along, like them film stars. But when you're a bit weird, people remember you.
You're daft, Amber said.
And you're still a bit weird as well. People know who you are, don't they? So that proves my point.
No, it doesn't. They know me because I've always lived here.
So are we having an argument already?
Amber said impatiently. Dolly laughed.
Why not? It beats moping about the place. By the way, how's Luke? Have you heard from him lately, or is that all off now?
For one stupendous second, Amber felt like crowing that she and Luke were as close as one person now. They were soulmates and bodymates, she thought with a delicious little shiver. And after that evening in the cave, nothing could separate them again. But then she sobered, because they were as physically separated by the war as if they were poles apart. And she didn't want to spoil the memory of that perfect evening by confiding in Dolly Daydream either. She jealously guarded that memory from everyone but herself and Luke.
I told you we weren't so close anymore, she said as coolly as she could. It was just a crush, that's all.
Dolly grinned.
So, when he comes marching home again, you won't mind if I ever go at him?
Amber felt a jolt in her stomach.
I didn't say that. Too bad, kid. But all's fair in love and war, isn't it? Anyway, I've still got to check out all these Yanks in the town. I wonder if I could get my old job back at the Forces Club, she said thoughtfully. You could put in a good word for me when you go back to work on Monday.
You really are planning to stay then? Amber said, hoping she didn't sound too dismayed. A visit was one thing. Moving in for good was something else.
For a while, Dolly said with a shrug. But you know me. I'll get fidgety if I'm in one place for too long, so I doubt if it will be forever.
Praise be, thought Amber. It was a week since Granny Penn had died. A turbulent week, as far as Amber was concerned, but, as everybody kept telling her, life had to go on, and you had no choice but to go on with it. Either that, or hang up your boots for good, and at 17 it seemed a waste of a future to even think of such a thing. Besides, Granny Penn would want her to carry on and be happy. She knew that without being told, and on the day after the funeral she and Dolly had set about going through her Gran's belongings properly. It was a task she had hated to think about, but it was far better to do it with Dolly's help than with Mrs. Phillips poking into Granny Penn's private things. They planned to take the boxes of clothes to the Red Cross, knowing they would find good homes from there,
what with clothes rationing and bombed-out people and all. If Dolly had had all this stuff in London, she told Amber, they would have done a roaring trade down the market among the old biddies. For all her sharp remarks, Dolly proved to be a godsend when it came to dealing with it all in a practical way, and one of the only times Amber found herself crying was when she packed up all her Gran's playing cards and such like, vowing never to look at them herself. Although the tears also began to flow when she finally made herself open her Gran's cardboard memory box. "What the heck's all that stuff?" Dolly said, as they sat on the bed in Granny Penn's room. "It's things she saved over the years. Special things that meant a lot to her. They belong to me now, and I'm not getting rid of any of it." "You're welcome to it. Most of it's a lot of old tat. Who's that old geezer?" Dolly asked, pointing to a faded sepia photograph. "I think that's my granddad. I never knew him, but Gran showed me his photo once. And this one..." She picked up another faded photo and ran her fingers lovingly over it. "This one is my mum and dad. I told you I never knew them either, and Gran could never bear to have them on show. But sometimes she let me have a look at them. Not for years now, though. I'd almost forgotten what they looked like." "You look a bit like your mother," Dolly said, "and I dare say you did just as well with your Gran bringing you up. My mum's never been much good, and my dad never could get the better of her." "That's an awful thing to say, especially after your dad was killed in the war." Dolly shrugged. "You probably had it better than me, with your Gran doting on you. You've seen my mum, and you know what she's like, and you might as well know that we had an almighty bust-up before I came down here, which is why I packed my bags and left." "So, that's why you came." Dolly glanced at her, seeing the red spots of anger on Amber's face now. "I came because you sent me the telegram saying Granny Penn had died, idiot. It just so happened that I was on the point of jumping on a train to anywhere, what with my mum harping on at me all the time and getting fed up with the bleeding air raids that have started again. They call it the Little Blitz now, because although it wasn't as bad as the first one, it's bad enough." She was rabbiting on because she was suddenly nervous, realising how she had upset Amber. But that was Dolly, always saying things before she stopped to think, no matter who got upset. She suddenly sat down heavily on the bed, glaring at Amber, and trying to blink back the unexpected shine of tears in her eyes. "You think I'm hard, don't you? You think I don't care that the nice old girl has popped it? Well, I do care. She was good to me. I cared about her a lot. This was the first decent home I'd lived in, what with my mum gallivanting about whenever she got the chance, and my dad too feeble to stand up to her. You were the lucky one, Amber, even without a mum and dad." "Crikey, if you don't stop, you'll have me bawling again in a minute," Amber said with a gulp. "Are you serious about working at the Forces Club, by the way? Do you want me to?" "Of course I do." Well, what else could she say? It would be cruel to say she didn't want Dolly there, or that she was jealous of Dolly's easy chat with the Yanks, or that she would prefer Dolly to be anywhere but here. It was easily arranged, and another pair of hands was never refused. With so many servicemen in the area now, the club was always full to bursting in the evenings and in the daytime too, when the men wanted somewhere to go for recreation. All the talk, however guarded, was of the coming invasion plans. There was still no date mentioned, but the town rattled with the sounds of dispatch riders going to and from the various barracks. Within a couple of weeks, Dolly had asked to use Granny Penn's bedroom, and although Amber was in two minds about whether or not to let her have it, it was a relief to both of them to sleep in separate rooms. Amber was fed up with hearing of Dolly's dates with any Yank who would ask her out, and she was continually fretting over the long silence from Luke. "You really must try not to worry, my dear," his mother told her whenever they met at church. I'm sure we'll both hear from him soon." She said it almost as a mantra, and Amber wondered if it was to reassure herself as much as Amber. Or did older people find it easier to be patient than those who were longing to feel their sweetheart's arms around them again? Against her will, Amber knew the memory of that evening in the cave was beginning to fade, and she couldn't bear it if that happened. She wanted to keep it fresh and new, and she was superstitiously afraid that if she lost it forever, it would mean that something bad had happened to Luke. She knew that Dolly would scoff at such omens, but Dolly didn't have her Cornish intuition, and anyway, it was something to hold on to. If the town had been bristling with army and amphibious vehicles before, and the harbour almost blocked by ships, it was overwhelmed with them over the next weeks. Excitement was high in everyone's mind now, because an Allied invasion would surely put an end to it all, and they could return to normal living again. Amber hadn't seen Gary for weeks, and chose to assume that he had been sent somewhere else on manoeuvres rather than think the worst. And then, very late, one evening towards the end of May, there was a knock on the cottage door.
"Blimey, it's a bit late for visiting," Dolly complained. "I was just getting ready for bed, and before you start panicking, it's a bit late for any telegram boys to come knocking."
Amber hadn't even considered such a thing as she ran to answer it, her heart thumping, her thoughts full of Luke. It would be just like him to arrive here without any warning, as he had done once before. She pulled open the door and gaped.
"It's you!"
Gary laughed easily.
"Yep, turning up again just like the bad penny. Sorry I haven't been in touch lately, honey, but you know how things are, and pretty soon our guys will be shipping out of here. Can't say when, but it'll be soon, and who knows when or if we'll be back here again."
"Don't say that," she said quickly. "And for goodness sake, come inside, Gary. It's great to see you again, but I've got my reputation to think about, you know." She tried to smile and to speak lightly, but it was hard to hide the searing disappointment that he wasn't Luke.
"Are you sure it's okay?"
he whispered in a conspiratorial manner.
"The old lady won't look down her nose at me for calling so late, will she?"
Feeling something like horror at the question, Amber looked at him mutely. He didn't know. Of course he didn't know. And why would anybody have thought to tell him? He was one GI among hundreds in the area, and he had been away on manoeuvres. And the death of one old lady wouldn't have been important news compared with the forthcoming most daring adventure of the war so far.
"What have I said?"
he asked at once, seeing her change of expression. Dolly pushed forward at hearing the American voice.
"How is it, Amber?"
"Say, I'm sorry," Gary said, backing away. "I didn't know you had company. I'll come back again another time."
Amber pulled him inside the cottage almost savagely.
"No, please don't go, Gary. You took me unawares, that's all. Come and meet my friend Dolly, and I'll tell you all my news."
By now, Dolly was looking more than interested in the handsome young GI who'd obviously taken a shine to Amber. She remembered the name from Amber's letters, and now that she saw him, she decided it was no wonder that Luke Gillam was out of the picture.
"Come and have some cocoa with us," Amber said mechanically. "I'm afraid we've got nothing more exciting than that to offer. Dolly won't mind making it."
Whether Dolly minded or not, Amber ignored her glare, and after a moment Dolly left them together, being sure to leave the adjoining door open so she could hear everything that went on. She didn't miss the way Gary sat close to Amber on the sofa and took her hands in his.
"Well, well. What's happened, honey?" he said quietly.
It was one thing to be gradually accepting the fact that she would never see Granny Penn again, and to get used to not having her around to scold or advise or just be there. It was a different matter when it came to telling people, to actually saying the words that Granny Penn had died. And before she knew it, she was blubbing on his shoulder and wondering wildly just how many tears a person could possibly have inside them.
"I'm sorry,"
she gasped finally, when she moved away from him, feeling foolish.
"I didn't mean that to happen. But I find it painful to actually say the words, let alone believe it. I keep expecting to come home from work and find her here, and it still gives me a little shock to know that it will never happen again."
You wouldn't be human if you didn't feel like that. It's a natural reaction. We've lost quite a few good buddies now, and it's hard to accept that they're not going home. I've written a few letters to relatives myself, and I know what it's like to try to make sense of it all.
But it doesn't make any sense, does it? Not in your case, anyway. My gran was old, and I suppose it's something you should expect. But I never did. I just thought she'd go on forever.
Dolly brought in 3 cups of cocoa and dumped them on the table.
She needs cheering up, not having gloomy faces around her. How about if I put on a gramophone record? You could teach us to jitterbug, Gary.
The other 2 looked at her as if she was mad, and she snapped at them.
Don't look at me like that. My dad was killed too, but it didn't mean me and me mum had to stop living.
You're right, Gary said. Okay, put the record on, and we'll give it a go.
They were both mad now, thought Amber, and there was no way she was going to get up and try to do a jitterbug. But after a few minutes of watching Dolly doing her best, she began to laugh, and when Gary put out his hand, she joined in. She couldn't imagine Granny Penn objecting to this anyway. By the time Gary left, they were less edgy with one another, and Dolly was declaring that if Amber didn't want a date with him, she wouldn't mind.
You needn't bother. He's got a girlfriend back home, and they're going to get engaged when he gets back, for good. That doesn't stop him having a bit of fun. You went out with him before, didn't you? Are you telling me you didn't have a bit of a kiss and cuddle?
No, we didn't. I was thinking about Luke at the time, and he was thinking about his girl. We just enjoyed one another's company, that's all. So don't try to make anything of it. Dolly laughed, clearly not believing a word of it.
Well, like I said, all's fair in love and war, girl.
On Bank Holiday Monday, the last Monday in May, the sound of German aircraft was heard shortly after midnight, and the bombers swept in across the harbour, the Carrick roads and the docks. People who hadn't taken to the air raid shelters stood outside their homes, watching in stunned horror as the leading planes dropped red and green flares to mark the bomb path, which Dolly called bleedin' stupid, because now the big guns knew just where to fire at them. But the planes continued relentlessly along the seafront to Swanpool and out towards the Helford River, dropping their bombs. Amber and Dolly went outside to watch the display, and learned later from an excited Mr. Phillips next door, on home guard duty, that an underground fuel tank at Swanpool had been hit, sending a surge of burning petrol flowing down the hillside towards the village. American soldiers and sailors awaiting embarkation joined scores of local firemen in putting out the blaze. Several houses and hotels were destroyed in the raid, bringing to mind that other one at the Lanigan Hotel, where everyone had been killed, including 2 schoolgirls. It was the only talking point for days, but then, just a week later, the weirdest thing happened. For so long now, the town and harbour had been packed to capacity with troops and vehicles, naval ships, American landing craft and infantry landing craft, all awaiting the instruction to go. And then, on the morning of June the 6th, they were gone. There was an almost eerie hush over the harbour as people went about their normal business that day, and gradually the news that everyone had guessed filtered through that D-Day, the Allied invasion of France, had at last begun.
It's going to be a bit dull here now, Dolly sulked. Though I suppose when they start sending casualties back, the more able-bodied ones will be glad of a few hours at the club.
You are a peg sometimes, aren't you, Dolly?
So
that all you can think about? That it'll be a bit dull around here? What about the poor devils on their way to France, and never knowing how many of them will be killed? Well, we can't do anything about it, can we? We might as well stay cheerful for when they do come back. You'll be thinking about Gary, I suppose. I'm thinking about all of them, Amber retorted. Of course she was thinking about Gary, but not only him. She was thinking more and more about Luke these days, and praying that he would come home safely. The only consolation, if she didn't hear from him, was that his mother wasn't getting any letters from him either. It was truly as if his ship had vanished, like the Murray Celeste. She had thought it once before, and it still made her feel sick with unease. The news that D-Day had been a stupendous success was broadcast on the wireless and filled the pages of every newspaper. At last, it seemed as if the Jerrys were on the run, and there were Allied victories being reported everywhere. Prayers that it would soon be over were on everyone's lips, but it was as though good news always had to be countered with bad, just as Granny Penn always said, and a week after the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy, the Germans unleashed their most vicious weapon yet, the doodlebug. That's not its real name, of course, Dolly told Amber, after a hysterical letter from her mum. But it makes it sound a bit less scary than the real name for it. Mum says they don't know it's coming, and then it drops without a sound and does a bleeding lot of damage. It wasn't only Dolly's mum who found it scary, thought Amber. Dolly had gone a sickly colour as she finished reading the letter. Blimey, she's talking about getting out of London now. I hope she don't start thinking about coming down here, because it's the last thing we want, ain't it? Well, she couldn't, because we don't have room, Amber said quickly, thinking that for once she was in total agreement with Dolly. She couldn't imagine sharing the cottage with Dolly's mum, with her cheap scent and her cigarettes. Is that the only reason? Dolly asked directly. Amber gave an uneasy laugh. It's the main one. And don't you think I've got enough to put up with, having you arguing with me day and night, without you and your mum going at it as well? Oh well, don't let me forget that you're in charge here now, will you? You're such a snob, Amber. You don't think we're good enough for you. I never said that. I never said that. You thought it, though. You and your gran. Amber couldn't let this pass. How can you say such a thing? Don't you remember when you first came here and you had practically nothing? Who was it who took you in and made you welcome and treated you no differently from the way she treated her own granddaughter? She felt the choking sensation in her throat again, remembering those days when she had been unbelievably jealous of Dolly Daydream and her blonde curls and her blue eyes and her dainty little body. It was true that she hadn't wanted her here in the beginning, but Granny Penn had made her see that she was being unkind to a young girl far from home, and eventually they had become closer than peas in a pod. The eerily same pod, once they had discovered that they shared a birthday. How spooky was that? Don't let's quarrel, Dolly. I'm sure your mum wouldn't want to come to Cornwall any more than you'd want her to. I'm right about that, aren't I? Dolly's face relaxed in a grin. Darn right you are. Imagine if Uncle Joe wanted to come as well, and we had to shove them both in Granny Penn's old bedroom and listen to their shenanigans every night. Oh, don't, Amber said, as the image of it started to make them both giggle, and then they were howling with laughter until their sides ached. Alone in bed in her own room now, Amber lay looking up at the ceiling, thinking over what had been said. She didn't think for a minute that Dolly's mum and Uncle Joe would want to evacuate to Falmouth at a time that everybody hoped was the late stage of the war, no matter what the Jerrys threw at them. It would be impossibly crowded in this little cottage. It was too crowded already. Her heart gave a small, uncomfortable leap at the thought. It wasn't that it was too small for the two of them. It was more that they were in one another's pockets the whole time now. It was like being two sisters who bickered constantly simply because they could never get away from one another. They lived in the same house, ate together, slept in adjoining rooms, cycled to work together, spent all day together. They were never apart. It was like being married without the fun. There and then, Amber made up her mind. Dolly had always enjoyed working and flirting at the Forces Club more than she did, and she had settled back into the old routine as if she had never been away. Besides, now that so many of the Forces had left the area, there was sometimes little to do for the staff there. So tomorrow she would look for another job, and the one she wanted more than any other was in Veal's craft shop, if she could bear to put up with Myra Veal's sniping. It was odd, but once she had made up her mind to do something positive, she had the most untroubled night's sleep since Granny Penn had died. For the first time, she felt she could sense a guardian angel keeping watch over her, and knew exactly who it would be.
"You're a glutton for punishment, aren't you?" Dolly said when she told her of her decision. "I thought you couldn't stand the old duck." "I'll just have to put up with her then, won't I? I liked working there and being surrounded by all the things they sold, and so as long as we keep out of one another's way, we'll be all right." "And how are you going to do that in such a poky little shop?" "I don't know," Amber said crossly. "But I just wish you'd stop making objections and putting doubts in my mind." As if they weren't there already. Not about the shop, just about Myra. But she wasn't going to be deterred. She wasn't due at the club until the afternoon, since they were still working in shifts, and she cycled into the town, marvelling at how vast the harbour looked now that so many of the landing craft and other invasion ships were gone. The weeks were moving on. Summer was slipping into autumn, and in Amber's eyes Pendennis Castle had never looked so impressive in all its sunlit splendour. With a fervour that startled her, she found herself wishing with all her might that no German bombs would ever rain down on that ancient fortress. It was what they stood for, Cornwall and England and all that. She was so caught up in her thoughts that she had to swerve to avoid a couple of small boys who yelled at her. They were carrying bits of shrapnel, and she thought what a strange world it was now, when twisted bits of metal had become such prizes for small boys to barter over. She went into the craft shop, breathing in the familiar smells of potpourri and other spicy scents. Myra immediately came through from the beaded curtain and gave a sniff when she saw it was Amber. "Me and Mother were just talking about you the other day," she said. "Were you? What about?" Amber said, caught off guard. "I've decided I want to go back to Redruth. I never did like Falmouth, and me and Mother can't live together forever, that's for sure. So, if you're fed up with your job at the Forces Club, you're welcome to this one." Amber felt her heart jump. "This is so weird," she said. "That's exactly why I've come to see you." "Well, we better see about it then, haven't we? It'll take a couple of weeks to get everything settled, but the sooner the better, I say." Myra gave her the first grudging smile Amber had ever seen on that plain face. It didn't improve her looks, but it sealed a bargain. "I still think you're mad," Dolly told her. "Why would you want to work in a shop like that instead of at the club? I'd be bored to death." Amber was tempted to echo something of Myra's feelings about her mother. "Maybe it's because you and I are too much in one another's pockets, and we'll probably end up hating each other, and this is the best way of disentangling ourselves." She didn't say it, but she thought it. "I always liked working there, and once Myra's gone, I'll be more or less my own boss. I won't be just one more girl in an overall." Dolly glared at her. "Suits me. I'm not sure how long I'll be staying anyway." "What do you mean?"
You're not thinking of going back to London now the Jerrys are dropping those doodlebugs, are you? Amber was alarmed. They might not be getting on as well anymore, but going back to London when she didn't have to sounded plain stupid. I might. I don't know. I'll see how things go. Well, don't do me any favours, Amber muttered. You've changed, Dolly said. Well, I should hope I have. And so have you. We're not 12 years old anymore, in case you hadn't noticed it. Oh, I've noticed it all right. You didn't want me then, and you don't want me now. You don't want to work with me, that's for sure. Amber sighed. Why are you being like this? Can't you see that it would be better for us to be apart for at least some part of the day? We're not Siamese twins, Dolly. No, just February ones, Dolly said. Oh, don't take any notice of me. I'm just fed up, that's all. Don't feel as if I belong here. And I feel it even less now that Granny Penn's gone. She sort of held us together, didn't she, girl? Well, if we're being honest with one another, I suppose she did. Dolly sat back on the sofa, her arms folded. So, when are you starting back at the craft shop, then?